for joining us here today. If you could please introduce yourselves.
I'm Jeanne.
And I'm Chuck Graham.
All right, so today's interview is going to focus along your personal history, your growing up, and how that all fits into the historical context of Comic-Con, and also your life and history. So the first question I'm going to ask you both is, how did you get your interest in comic books, sci-fi, movies, or anything pop culture?
How did I? Oh my goodness! Started reading science fiction novels in grade school. Ray Bradbury and the Narnian Chronicles, and things that I just loved fantasy from the get-go, from the cradle. Like my mom read us fairy tales and things. I thought all that was just wonderful. It made regular novels boring by comparison to me. So I grew up with fantasy, and then in 1966, this thing called Star Trek came along, and I fell hopelessly in love with that, and started writing to pen pals all over the world at the time the show was on the air. So during the late 60s, when it was still on the air, I was writing to, I think, 350 pen friends around the globe at the time, and that was really the precursor of meeting up with other fans at San Diego State when I went out there in 70 and 71. Started meeting other Star Trek fans. That was great. And we started getting together and at a table out at San Diego State and talking. And eventually we had a costume party at my parents' house that became Star San Diego in 72. So then from there, meeting Comic-Con committee members, and we set up a Star Trek exhibit at Comic-Con, and in 73 and 4 after that.
Well, for me, it was a combination of reading comics and watching old movies when I was a little kid. I remember there was in 1960 a movie that came out, a very famous movie called The Time Machine, where he would sit in that machine and pull that little lever back and forth. Remember that big wheel that went round and round and round? So I went to my grandparents who raised me and said, "Can I get a copy of this book by this guy named H.G. Wells?" And so we went to the bookstore, and lo and behold, there was a little Pickwick Books, I think it was, and there was a little Berkeley Books edition of The Time Machine, 25 cents, which I bought, and that was the very first science fiction book I ever read. I still have that.
Still has that book.
And they used to let me read classic illustrated comics, and through that I found out about Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and some of the other early science fiction writers, and I went out and bought those books too, and read those, and then I started reading some of the science fiction magazines in the 60s as well, and my interest, like hers, sort of blossomed out from there. And when I went out to UCSD as a student in the fall of 1969, I was a history major, and one of the other early Comic-Con people, Richard Butner, was in some of my classes, and we discovered a mutual interest, and that's how both of us eventually ended up on the Comic-Con committee. I found out about Star through Richard, as a matter of fact. We went to Comic-Con first time in 1972, and kept in touch with some of the people that we met there, and I heard from him about Star, and I didn't get on the early meetings, but I called the number that I got and to find out about the meeting, and I expected a guy to answer the phone because I'd written down the name Jeanne, G-E-N-E, Peacock. And so I dialed the number, and
You dialed it back.
I dialed the number, yes. And this girl answered the phone, and I was a little bit flabbergasted because I didn't associate too many young ladies with science fiction or comics fandom at the time, and but I didn't let my surprise show through. So I found out about the details of the meeting, and my first Star meeting was in February of 1973. That's where I met her, and from that point on, we got more and more involved with Comic-Con, and ended up on the committee that year, ended in 1974. And we were only on the committee for 2 years, because after that we left to run a science fiction convention here in San Diego, which was called mainly Star Trek, which was called EchoCon 75, which was also held at the El Cortez.
I'm assuming like Star Wars fans be damned in this conference.
Well, this was before Star Wars.
This was before Star Wars.
Okay.
Yes.
This was in 75. Star Wars didn't come out for 2 more years.
Okay.
Star Wars was yet but a twinkle in Georgie Lucas's eye.
So I actually want to go back to you two. Did you start dating in the course of Star, or in the course
Yes.
of creating the new conference in '72?
Well, we'd known each other for about a year before we even started dating. We both were very busy with school and so forth, and so because I had a summer job, I couldn't go to all of the Star meetings. But eventually we started dating in 1974, and we had a really long engagement. We were engaged for about 3 years before we finally got married in '77.
We were too
So-
busy.
so
we were too busy.
we
to
were
get
too
married.
busy, so it was a long
Finishing the
engagement.
degrees. But yeah, and my father, who always teased me about Star Trek, he always called it Star Trek, and was always teasing me because he never really got it. And I always used to say, "Well, you see, Dad, I told you Star Trek was good for something."
And I was flattered because he didn't disagree with that.
No, he didn't. Yeah.
So I gotta ask, did you do anything Star Trek for your wedding or your
Yes.
proposal?
Well, we didn't have a Star Trek wedding per se. No, we did have some of the music. We had Beyond Antares played at the wedding. We just didn't tell the church organist that that's where it came from. They probably wouldn't have done it if we had told them. I think I put some phony name on it. I forget what, or I put Beyond Antares, but I didn't attribute it to Star Trek, or they probably would have said no.
And
I
a
also
lot of
had
our friends from Star came to our wedding.
300 people were at our wedding.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I also had some music from Dark Shadows, Quentin's theme. I didn't tell them where that came from either.
This is the '70s. Like, how did your friends and family react that you were getting involved with sci-fi and getting to really deeper involvement organizing conferences that brought together people who liked sci-fi and comics?
Go ahead.
It depended on who you were telling about it. My mom was pretty cool with it. My parents were pretty cool with the whole thing. They liked having the first year of most of the first year of Star meetings were in my parents' living room, and it outgrew that very quickly. And they were fine with that. They loved it. Church people, not so much. You had a hard time explaining any of it to them, and some of the relatives just didn't get it. Just thought, you're crazy. What are you getting involved in this strange stuff for? And some of them would outright think you were getting involved in some satanic cult. I mean, seriously, they did. But for the most part, the family was very cool with it. They liked all you guys.
Well, my grandparents were of the generation before the greatest generation, because my grandfather was born in 1901 and my grandmother in 1907, and they both had very, very long lives. And they had read some of these same books when they were kids as well. My grandfather loved Jules Verne, and he liked H.G. Wells, and my grandma was familiar with some of that too. So they didn't really have a problem with it. They always advised me to be very, very careful of some of the people that I was getting involved in the Comic-Con group, because they could see that, well, some of the things that they seemed to be interested in were the sort of things that they really didn't like, and I really didn't like either. When I told them that some of the early meetings were at Ken Kruger's bookstore, and that in the back room of that there was a lot of, well, pornographic material, which we didn't really like. They said, well, you watch out for that. Don't get involved with any of that.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get involved with any of the people who might want to draw you into that sort of thing. So I said, well, we can take care of ourselves. And that was one aspect of the whole thing that we found to be sort of distasteful, but it didn't inhibit us from working on the committee. But they were okay with it, and they said as long as they were sure that we weren't letting ourselves get involved in anything, shall we say, from the dark side.
So, what year did you both start to get involved with the committee? And you could highlight a little bit, when did you first start meeting some of the original core founders, such as Sheldorf, Richard Alf, Mike Towery?
1973.
When we actually got involved in the committee, we were asked to set up, Star was asked to set up an exhibit, and 73 was at the Sheraton out near Harbor Island, near the airport. And we were asked to set up a whole room of Star Trek material and exhibits, which we did. And Walter Koenig came and was our guest, and Dorothy Fontana, who was a writer for Star Trek. And then we had peripheral to Star Trek, Larry Vincent, who was a horror movie host in LA that went by the name Seymour. And he was a lot of fun. He came. So they were sort of our three guests. And that went over very well. We had a ball and came in Star Trek costumes, and the news media would come, and they would always focus on the Star Trek costumes because they were the most colorful outfits instead of the comic book costumes, some of which were colorful too. But for some reason, Star Trek, being such a big fandom at the time, kind of got all the media attention. So not that the news was ever really nice to us. They were very condescending. Oh, look at these freaky people kind of an attitude. But yeah, we were asked to, Star was asked to set up. We did that 2 years in a row. 74 at the El Cortez. Had another entire room exhibit.
And I was the copy editor of the school paper out at UCSD, the Triton Times, as it was known back then, for several years. And one day at one of our meetings, Richard happened to mention to Shell that I had a lot of graphic arts experience doing that. And he said, "Oh, how would you like to handle our publications this year?" And so I accepted that job. And so that was my entrance into the committee. It was a job I did for 2 years.
And that was long before computers. So you cut and pasted literally the material together with a proportion wheel and a blue pencil and a lot of paste.
And a T-square and
T-square.
A lot of, well,
correction tape and
things that are totally obsolete now.
Yeah, you had these little wheels of graphic tape that had different patterns that you had to lay down on the layout board. You had a big board, sometimes with blue line graph on it. It was a lot of work.
And then you took your mock-ups to a printer and got a rough copy of the program book and had to edit all that by hand.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work.
And then you had to have a metal plate shot before it could be printed. Big aluminum plate that went on the press. And you had to find a special place to do that could do that for you. It was a very involved process getting anything printed back then. It's a lot more work than it is now.
But I did it gladly because I was so enthusiastic about the whole thing at the time.
Yeah. We didn't get paid anything for all that work we did. Didn't get any salary. See, now Comic-Con is a corporation and its main officers are paid. It's a salaried position. We didn't get any. We weren't that lucky back then. It would be a real job now.
It would be.
Publications person has a real job now. I'm sure he's a salaried position probably. I don't know, but I assume, since I know they have a board and a paid.
With their involvement on that board, what was the makeup like? How many people were organizing, if you remember from those meetings?
Well, we had a core group of about 10 to 12 people.
It was about a dozen.
Not all of the people who started Comic-Con and were involved with it for the first 2 or 3 years were on the board by then. Some of them had left and whom I never really knew. And then a lot of new people had come in the same year we did.
So for the people who had left, do you have?
Well, I never really knew Mike Towery or Richard Alp because by the time I came onto the committee, they were gone. I knew Barry Alfonso and of course Sheldorf, Richard Butner, and I did know
Bill
Lund,
yeah.
and of course I met Ken Kruger in the course of events, but we didn't really have much connection with the other founders who were gone by then.
Yeah, but I do have some pictures on a CD I'll give you of some of the early meetings with the Comic-Con people. You may have seen them on Facebook or not, but I'll give them to you. And
we had a lot of our early meetings out in the open at Kate Sessions Park over in Pacific Beach because it was a nice place and there were picnic tables. People would bring food and we'd discuss whatever we needed to discuss. And we had those meetings. How often were they? Once every couple of weeks?
or so. Yeah, you had to have a lot of meetings then because there were no computers to Facebook on or email yet, so everybody had to meet in person and talk over the various committee positions and what they'd done and what needed to be done and so forth. And also gathered at a lot of restaurants, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
Ate a lot of
And somehow it all managed to fall together.
somehow. Well, occasionally it fell apart, but some things did.
Was there a memorable experience of when it came together, or a memorable experience when it came crashing down?
Well, it came together the first day of the convention.
Yeah.
That was really the time when you found out that whether or not everything that you had planned and organized was really going to work.
Or not. I don't think we had any spectacular failures on our particular positions
No, I
that
don't
we
think
worked
so.
in. Well, there were other things that went wrong. I mean, there were always some pranksters pulling silly stunts at the convention.
Or
us.
guests wouldn't show up, or somebody's car would break down, or the film projector wouldn't work, or somebody stopped it and burned a hole in the film.
There were a lot of things that would go wrong, but nothing disastrous that I can recall. Just there were a lot of pranks. The early committee people, Scott Shaw was just talking about that upstairs with Greg Barrett and company. Somebody poured shark repellent in the swimming pool at the El Cortez in '74. Why? I don't know. Pulled the fire alarm. And there were a lot of schoolboy pranks that they liked to pull. But
Were there any more elaborate pranks like the shark repellent?
that was one of the best ones, I think. Stupidest ones, depending on your point of view. But
One time, some of us found the freight elevator at the back end of the El Cortez, and we got into it and pulled the lever and went all the way down to the basement. And we found all sorts of neat things down there that had been in that basement since the hotel was built, which was 1927.
yes.
And old furniture, and what else was down there?
There was a big peacock chair. I remember that because it was one of those big rattan fan-backed chairs with the peacock design, and I liked that.
So we knew we weren't supposed to be down there, and we're wondering if we would be found out, but we spent about half an hour, 45 minutes down there just rummaging through all that stuff just to see what was there, and it was kind of spooky, but we enjoyed looking through all that old stuff. And
you remember there was a coal chute from when it was built in the 20s. San Diego still had coal-heated buildings, and there was a coal chute for the delivery to come down into the basement for they ran the heaters back then. The El Cortez was a great place. It was a lot of fun, and I'm glad it's been saved as a city landmark and even though it's turned into condos, but it was a lot of fun for conventions. You could just
then we got back in the elevator and pushed the lever the other way and went clanking back up to the ground floor. And
yeah, I think the elevator was from the 20s too.
one evening after the programming was over, I actually found a grand piano in one of the rooms that wasn't being used, so I sat down and played the piano for an hour or two.
I have a picture of you sitting at that grand piano, but it had been kept in a very hot basement or wherever they had stored it.
So it was woefully out of tune.
So the soundboard on it was badly warped, so the poor thing was very badly out of tune, yes.
But that was one of my most memorable Comic-Con experiences, just sitting there and playing that piano.
It's a great grand piano.
Although, yeah, I think maybe Beethoven was a little bit out of place at Comic-Con, but that's what I knew best.
Schroeder liked him.
Yeah.
So the Comic-Cons that you both sat on as organizing committee was at the El Cortez, correct?
Well,
no.
73 was in
1973 was at the Sheraton Airport.
And then it moved to the...
And then 74 it went back to the El Cortez.
Okay. So talk a little bit more about the Sheraton, because we haven't had a lot of people comment on that. What brought Comic-Con to the Sheraton?
I'm not sure why they went there from El Cortez. It might have been that the dates they wanted were booked already.
Well, I think it was because, too, that the committee for 1973 came together at such a late date, and so much of the planning had to be done at the last minute that we were looking around simply for a place that was available for the date that we wanted. And the El Cortez wasn't available.
I think that was it.
It was booked up for every weekend during that summer, so we called around and tried to find a place that could take us for 4 days on any one of those summer weekends in July or August. And the Sheraton had an open weekend, so we took that.
And who was the board chair or the
Bill Lund?
Bill Lund was he both years that we went?
Yeah,
I thought so. Yeah.
Okay. And who else was sitting on the board at the time with you?
Well, we really didn't have a board. We just had
a committee. We just call it a committee.
Yeah.
Well,
it's a board now.
Richard Butner, and of course the two of us, and I think Barry was,
and that other Richard, the blonde guy, was Richard.
Was it Bill Richardson?
Bill Richardson. I'm getting my names mixed up. Yeah, I think so.
And we had a fellow named Ed Nizaborski, who did our art. I believe he did our art show.
Yeah,
that was the core group. Then she was the Star Trek liaison, and I was the publications.
Yeah,
it wasn't a very big group.
About a dozen people. that did most all of it. And then we had gophers and other little volunteers that came and worked for a membership. And
A lot
It
of the
wasn't a
people
big
from
committee.
Star San Diego did some of the grunt work
yeah,
back then.
they did.
The Gophers, they went for this and went for that.
Yeah, go for this and go for that.
What was grunt work defined as for Comic-Con at the time?
Well, making sure that the celebrity guests got chauffeured from the airport and taken care of whatever they needed, their hotel room booked. They would shepherd them around. That was one thing. Anything that needed doing. I mean, running after cups of coffee for people on panels.
Taking rough drafts of program books back to the printer and
Yeah.
then back to my house for proofreading. You couldn't make a PDF file then.
That was pre-con gophers. Yeah.
And just making sure that everything, that the films were in the film room at the time that film was scheduled to be shown.
Mm-hmm.
Just making sure that all the cogs were well greased, so to speak.
Just kept things running on schedule. And we never seemed to have any problem. Well, there were glitches here and there where something would get stolen or what have you. But for the most part, I think it ran pretty smoothly from our perspective. We weren't.
Well, we didn't know
Running it.
we didn't
Yeah,
know
we weren't-
everything.
we weren't
that was
running the
going
whole
on.
show
We were
by any
concerned
means.
with only our particular areas of responsibility, but
So your job was really finished by the time you got to the convention. So you didn't.
Pretty
Yeah,
much,
your
yeah.
your publication was done. So did you put out a newsletter, daily newsletter?
we did
update
we
thing?
did a daily newsletter.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and so you were doing that at the con, but most of his hard work was before the con. So
I had to run back to the bookstore in Ocean Beach every day with the latest updates and,
Yeah.
and run the mimeograph machine over there to run off a few hundred copies of the newsletter with the latest updates and schedule changes, if any, that sort of thing, and the attendance figures for each day, and
Mhm.
they went up and up 700, 800, 900. I think it was last day of the convention in '73. We finally broke 1,000 in
Mhm.
attendance, which included not only the full memberships but also all the one-day memberships.
and that was great.
And that was
That was
kind of a significant milestone.
Big milestone,
because,
yes.
we never had 1,000 people before.
No.
Of course, that sounds kind of grotesque now, but at the time we thought it was pretty notable.
It was. And Comic-Con began to get a certain amount of cachet because as it grew, the news media, it was an inverse proportion. The news media became less and less condescending and started really taking notice as it grew over the years. And the bigger it got and the more money it started pulling into San Diego, the less they sneered in their news reports at all those geeky people.
Yeah,
in
they
costume.
had a very
Yes.
very condescending,
Oh,
and patronizing attitude in most of their news reports.
Some of them
First, look at
still-
all of the Star Trek, look at all the comic book geeks. But
Yes.
As time went on, that gradually started to change,
To
and
flip.
we gained a greater amount of credibility. And,
Mhm.
and as comics and Star Trek became more and more of a part of popular culture, a certain greater amount of respect came along with that. So we felt sort of vindicated after a while.
Mm-hmm. Very much.
Going back to the organizing committee, were you the only woman on the committee?
Oh no, there were a few other women. Vicky Kelso was the registration chairman or head of registration. There were some others over the various years, and there were a couple early on. Wendy All came in.
and
She
then,
wasn't there the 2 years we were. She was out of the country, but she came back 75, I think she
And
said.
then Jackie Estrada.
Jackie
was there
Estrada came early on. And there were some others, so it wasn't all. It was a male-dominated group, yes, perforce, because there weren't that many girls into comic books yet. The girls were really that barrier broke with Star Trek fandom, really, when girls who liked Mr. Spock and they liked Star Trek came in, and then they crossed over into comic book culture and found that they liked a lot of those things too. Japanese animation, things that were involved in comic books that they hadn't known about and discovered that they liked. So it grew very quickly, very rapidly after that. But Star Trek fandom really broke that barrier initially. Because before that, prior to that, science fiction conventions had been almost all male. it was considered a guy thing, reading science fiction. And
many female writers took
Yes.
male pen names
Yes.
just so they could get published.
and because the attitude was that a man wasn't going to read a book written by a woman, and a woman wasn't going to read science fiction because it was a male dominated field. So those prejudices survived for quite a while, and after Star Trek fandom, that began to change. That really began to change it when they realized, oh, hey, we like this stuff. It's good.
But a lot of people didn't know that D.C. Fontana was really Dorothy Fontana,
Yeah.
for example, and that C.L. Moore, the science fiction writer, was actually Catherine L. Moore, and she was the wife of Henry Kuttner.
And then Andre Norton wasn't a man.
Mhm.
He was a pen name. So you had to hide behind a male pen name for a long time.
So was there at the conferences, either the Star Trek conference or the Comic-Con, was there reactions if the female authors came, or
You mean negative reactions?
any reaction? What was the reaction?
I don't recall that there was any particular bias left among comic fans, because fandom is a very accepting group of people. Whether it didn't matter what gender you were, what race you were, whether you had physical handicaps or not, everybody was accepted, and that was part of the appeal to a lot of us of fandom, because we used to have people come to Star meetings who were just absolutely enthralled to find acceptance among people who appreciated the same things that they did, but also didn't care what you looked like, how fat or thin you were, how any of that, none of that mattered. Whereas in school or in the real world, they were ridiculed or made fun of often, and they never found that for the most part, in fandom. So I don't recall Comic-Con ever having any problem with women getting up on the panels and saying, hey, I'm really Dorothy, not DC, and I wrote this. They usually got cheered very loudly. So it was groundbreaking in that sense too, Comic-Con was, because it was kind of a we have arrived.
Mm-hmm.
Women, I am woman, hear me roar.
So these women felt vindicated too.
Sure they did.
After a fashion.
Yeah, because, well, in the sexist 50s, you could not submit a manuscript with a woman's name on it to a mainline publisher for the most part. They would not even read it. Because, and it worked the other way around too. If you were a man, forget writing romance novels. I mean, you couldn't do it. You'd have to write it with a female pen name. So there was a flip side to that.
But that changed too.
Eventually.
Marion Ross.
Yeah, well, eventually it fell by the wayside. Some of it still goes on. There's still some. If you're a woman and you want to write a men's adventure novel, you're probably going to want to use a male pseudonym. It's still there to a degree, but not like it used to be.
So you two leave after 2 years of involvement on the organizing committee.
Mm-hmm.
And you go with the Star Trek.
We were running Equicon 75, FilmCon 3. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And is that still continuing?
No, it went on for a few more years after that. It came down here for just that 1 year, and then it went back to LA. It had come down from LA. And I think it ran until 77.
I think 77 was the last one.
77 was the last one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there were professional conventions that kind of took over from there. Creation Con, which was run by the publishers of Starlog magazine, kind of took over the Star Trek and science fiction convention circuit after that. And I don't think they're doing those anymore, are they?
And after that, we had minor roles on different convention committees from here in San Diego from time to time.
Yeah.
Did you stay involved with Comic-Con post your 2 years?
Somewhat, yeah. I used to go down and help with registration. Used to help Vicki with registration, and yeah, we did. And I did panels for years before it became the big Hollywood extravaganza it is now. We used to have a lot of fan panels, and we would talk about Star and Star Trek.
And we've been pretty faithful in our attendance
pretty
from
much
that time till now.
So yeah, we've gone just about every year. Might have missed one or two in there.
So how's the evolution of Comic-Con been for you to observe being there in its initial formative years into today?
Well, I don't think anybody back then could have foreseen in their wildest dreams how big it would become. or the size of the crowds that it would attract, or the mass appeal that it would eventually have to popular culture. We were just a bunch of kids who liked comic books and some science fiction, and we never thought that Hollywood would get involved in it to the degree that it has.
Well, same here. Never foresaw any of the exponential growth that it experienced, and eventually it got so big I can't even walk into the dealer's room anymore because I'm crowdphobic, aquaphobic is what it's called, and too many people pushing me. So I managed to walk through it this last time for the first time in years, but it's difficult when it's that crowded to even see anything. So in that sense, to me, it's not even fun anymore.
Yeah, well, that's the main thing that makes it somewhat less enjoyable for us now. It's just we just can't take the crowds. It's difficult to go into that dealer's room now without feeling like a sardine.
And my phobias can't take it.
Sometimes we have trouble making it from one end of the room to the other. We just got to get out of here. So we go up to the mezzanine for a while before descending back down into the crowd again to try and get to the other end. And
so I had a lot more fun in the early days when it wasn't a big convention. But,
and that's why we're here at this convention.
Yeah.
Because it really recaptures the mood of those, the atmosphere of those early days. I'm really glad that Mike thought of doing it.
I hope he can keep doing it.
I hope so.
It's a nice
have to see if it makes money or not, or at least breaks even.
We call it a relaxicon when you have a nice uncrowded venue and you can sit and talk to people, and that was the idea, I gather. So.
Well, that still goes on at Comic-Con too, but we just don't like the huge crowds.
So I know there's that emphasis with movies and television, but do you think that comic books and science fiction still receive the same sort of dues?
Well, they're still very, very prominent, of course, but not as much as they used to be.
No.
If you look at the proportion of that dealer's room that's devoted to media, to Hollywood and movie-related items, and the proportion devoted to comic books, I think the proportion devoted to comic books continues to decrease a little bit from year to year.
Yeah.
A lot of the small comic book dealers have been forced out because they can no longer afford the prices charged for the dealers' tables.
Yeah. And the term I keep hearing about the Hollywood element is that they've hijacked Comic-Con, which is
maybe that's not the right word to use.
It's disputed, but and they of course say that that's not the case. But it's taken over more and more space.
And there used to be book dealers who would come
they're
too,
gone.
And they're all gone now too. And those who would sell old science fiction magazines as well as comic books, those are what I look for these days, and toys.
Yeah, those are all
a lot of those smaller dealers are gone now. It seems to be a venue mainly for the big time players now, which I think is a sad thing to see.
Yeah, by toys I meant not the toy companies that come down there now, Mattel and Hasbro and what have you. The toy collectors used to come with antique toys to sell, which and for a while their Beanie Babies kind of ruled the roost, and everybody was selling Beanie Babies. that fad didn't last long, thank goodness. But there used to be people who sold old books, toys, games. The things you'd see on Antiques Roadshow now were collectible tables that would be set up.
One year there was a guy who had a 1906 Victrola with the wax cylinders.
I remember that.
And he was actually making it play, and it worked.
It was great.
It was great.
Loved it. Yeah. And he was selling CDs that he made of Victrola playing the old cylinders.
But as time has gone on, you've seen less and less people in things like that, which I think is unfortunate.
Yeah.
So, did the original Comic-Cons have that feel of anachronism, bringing all these old items in to just to be viewed and taken in by science fiction comic book fans?
Oh, sure. Well, they were for sale. I mean, they would bring in these old collections, not just comics, but toys and things, and sell them. And you would have collectors come in who were looking for just that sort of thing. A friend that goes down to Comic-Con with me every year collects Godzilla. So he's always looking for different Godzilla toys. But he's been disappointed because recently you don't find the toy collectors aren't there anymore, which is sad. that's a loss, I think.
Well, it's not particularly anachronistic. I mean, I guess you could say any place where old items are on display is anachronistic in the sense that you were using the word, but it's kind of a situation where you don't have the variety of things available anymore like you used to, because the focus is now more on the mass media stuff.
Yeah, movies and TV
I
shows.
guess the choosing the word anachronistic, I think it's just more to bring some of the old stuff back to life, or
Oh.
Well, it would be nice. It would be nice to see more of that again, because it would give it would be something that would attract more people and a greater variety of people to the convention, rather than those who just want to go to see previews of the latest movie, or to meet whoever the big star of the moment happens to be.
Which is what's become the primary focus now. So none of that was there. You could say that Star was responsible for starting it in a way, because we were the first media group to meet in conjunction with Comic-Con, but we weren't the sole cause of it, obviously. But we were sort of the first media feature they had was Star Trek. And there was a certain amount of friction, because as I said, when the news cameras came down, they wanted to film the Star Trek people, and they kind of ignored the comic book people. So we were freakier to them, and more colorful costumes and what have you. So some of the comic book people were a little annoyed at the Star Trek people over that, but they got over it. But
So I have a Star Trek question, but I want to bring it back to Chuck. It's you said like I think hijacked wasn't the right word for it. What word do you think is more appropriate for Hollywood's sort of
Dominated.
And going back to you, Jeanne, were you able to bring any stars of Star Trek? And like just like get a basis of the years, was this Captain Kirk Star Trek?
well, not in our day.
Not here.
We had Walter Koenig both years that we set up the room exhibit. He came. He was a comic book fan also.
Okay.
He collected big little books, and would bring his little boy and his wife. The second year he brought his wife down, and she caught the measles and had to stay in the hotel room the whole time. So that was sad. But Dorothy Fontana. Those were the two Trek cast and crew members we had at the Comic-Con exhibit.
We got a lot more of them at Equicon.
Equicon had quite a few more, most of them. But
So if we actually go into Equicon, how did Equicon form?
it was formed up by a committee in Los Angeles, and then came down here just for the 1 year. Shatner and Nimoy didn't come to it our year. They were there at other times in LA, but we had the rest of them though in ours, and they just wanted someone else to run it for a year, so we did. Practically had a nervous breakdown trying to get everything to come together, but it barely managed to break even. So we had 5,500 people overrunning the El Cortez. I think in the hotel's words, we caught them with their pants down. They really didn't believe that Star Trek was big enough to have that many people show up. And they didn't believe us when we said, we're going to have 5,000 people. And they said, nah. They ran out of rooms. Some people were very upset that they had to book. We had quite a few hotels downtown all booked in, and a bus running up Ash Street.
And then there were a bunch of little motels
all around it.
Down around the El
Yeah.
Cortez, and those all got booked up too.
Yeah.
It was kind of exhilarating to see so many people at a Star Trek convention.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was primarily a Star Trek convention and a film convention. So back then you had to set up a projector, like you said, to run the movies. No VCRs yet, let alone computers or DVDs. So it was ancient technology that you had to deal with that was breaking down.
There was
a
a
lot.
place downtown, or up in, I think it was up in North Park, called
Park.
Knight's Film Library, where they kept archives of all these old movies in metal cans that you could rent 16 or even 35 millimeter prints of.
Yeah, we ran some 35 millimeter
Mm-hmm.
at Equicon. You had to hire a union projectionist to do that, because 35 millimeter used a carbon arc lamp in the projector. It was a big projector. And the carbon arc was literally a cone of carbon that burned inside the thing. and had in order to shoot a bright enough beam of light at the screen. So that was interesting to watch. That guy actually took a barbecue lighter and lit
the
carbon arc inside the thing. It's kind of scary.
A little bit dangerous too
was
if you don't know
dangerous.
what you're doing.
Yes, it was. That's how they got the bright enough beam to project on a wide screen.
So we just did it for that 1 year because we wanted to help the committee up in LA, which had been sort of overwhelmed by doing the first two, and we were sort of did them a favor and brought it down here and ran it for a year. And it was kind of a sop thrown to the San Diego fans too, so they wouldn't all have to go up to Los Angeles for at least one time for a big Star Trek convention.
But then it went back.
It went back the next year
and ran a couple more years after ours.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so we had Greg Berry yesterday and he talked about starting the sci-fi classes. Can you tell us a little bit more about those classes and Professor Chater?
Mrs. Chater was a very sweet lady who loved science fiction. She wrote romance novels, is what she published, but she loved science fiction. And Greg and I were in her classes, and I believe David Brin was. I'm not sure about David. He was out there around the same time. And this very shy guy named Joe Michael Straczynski, he was just Joe when he was in our classes. He hated to read his material out loud. And I hated to do it too. So we would sort of swap manuscripts and say, well, you read mine and I'll read yours, because I hate reading my own stuff out loud. And Betty Chater could never get him to read out loud. And I did a panel with him a few years ago at a convention. He didn't remember me, but I remember him, because I said, you were the guy who hated to read your stuff out loud. And so, of course, he now has done a little thing called Babylon 5 and a few other things on TV. But Greg I went to high school at Crawford High with Greg and went out to state. And our first writers group that we ever formed, that I ever was in, Betty Chater formed at her house in La Mesa, and Greg and I were both in that. And then he got famous and rich, and I didn't. That's not fair, you know. But no, Greg was very good writer, even in high school. He was always writing. And he used to come to meetings at our house.
One time when he was just starting out, he'd only written 2 books, Cyclone and Beyond Heaven's River.
When he still lived in San Diego.
When he still lived in San Diego. And he came to our house one time. We were having a little book discussion group, and it met from month to month. This is something separate from Star or Comic-Con. And he came driving up in this beat-up old 67 Dodge Dart, which was the only car he could afford to own at the time, the beat-up old thing. But it got him from point A to point B. That's, I think, the best you could say about it. But he was very personable and very flattered that people were reading his books and had questions for him about them, and that he could explain things that we didn't understand.
Well, he also came to speak to my writers' workshops. I taught writers' workshops at a place called Writers Haven on Adams Avenue for many years, and he came and talked to one of my groups there. That was a lot of fun. He's a very good speaker, as you probably noticed.
But all this sort of originated and revolved around Mrs. Chater, sort of as the nucleus of the whole thing.
What was the reception of Professor Chater's class, the sci-fi class in the English department at SDSU?
I don't recall there was any friction, as far as, you mean from the administration not liking science fiction? Or
from both, from the English department, and then also what was the reaction of the student body?
To a class specializing in science fiction?
Yes.
We loved it. I mean, she had very full classes for the science fiction courses. It was becoming a bigger and bigger thing of interest, and I don't recall any negativity about it, because it was by that time considered an academic pursuit. Science fiction was part of literature, and the ivory towers, there was always a snooty attitude of, that's not literature. But San Diego State's never been a particularly ivory tower place where it was too much nose in the air attitude. I mean, if you were at Harvard, maybe, but not out here. I had a collection of paperbacks that I entered in a contest at the library there one year. think it was 76, just before we graduated, that Ballantine Books published a series of previously out-of-print fantasy novels, and they put a unicorn label, so they were known as the Unicorn series. And they were very hard to find, all of them. Very difficult to find, especially The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And finally found the last one. So I entered the collections contest for the Love Library. I got second place, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. First place was a guy who had an absolutely gorgeous collection of books about the American Indians. But my little science fiction fantasy collection got second place in the contest. I don't remember how many people entered, so that may not have been as big an accomplishment as it sounds, but it was fun.
But there was a great degree of acceptance of that sort of thing by the mid-70s.
By that point, it was becoming more accepted. And Star Trek also helped in that regard, I think, because it became more mainstream eventually. And at the time, we were still the Star Trek Association for Revival, trying to get the series back on the air. With the original cast was the intent. And we got the animated series, which was not great, but it was something. And it was 1979 before we got the first movie. And we never got the original cast back on the TV, in a TV series, but of course then you got all the other ones, Next Generation and so on. So our mission was sort of fulfilled, not as we originally wanted it to be, because we would have liked the original cast back on TV. But
well,
can't say we did badly
can't have
anyway.
everything.
I think the little Star Trek franchise has done pretty well for itself over the years, despite that. Not what many people thought, because when I was in high school and Star Trek was on the air, people were laughing at me for writing letters to NBC saying, put it back on. Don't cancel my show. Laughing at me and saying, oh, it's a stupid show. In a couple of years, no one's going to remember it. Yeah.
No, but Mrs. Chater was a very, very big part of all this.
Yes, she was our on-campus advisor when we started Star San Diego, and it was meeting out of state. Initially met at my parents' house, but then when we moved out to state, she was our on-campus advisor for many years, and then Suzette Elgin after that. And,
how long did Professor Chater teach the sci-fi course?
Oh, heavens. I don't know how many years, quite a few years. She retired in the 80s, I think. Do you know? Yeah.
And then went on writing romance novels after that.
Quite a few romance novels. I think I have them all. And she did do at least one science fiction novel, but she wrote it as Lee, L-E-E, Chator, a pen name, because it was done in a time, I don't know if it was 60s or 70s, when the publishers still thought that women didn't write science fiction. So
there we go again.
It was under a pen name, yeah.
So I actually want to go back to the El Cortez.
Mm-hmm.
What was sort of the culture running around the hotel of the weekend of Comic-Con or the Star Trek film?
Well, you might want to call it more of a counterculture than a culture.
I was going to say the same thing. I don't know how cultured it was.
Well, you had comic book and science fiction fans going around in or out of costume and carrying around books and comic books and things. And of course, the normal people, or the mundane people, it's better.
Maybe call them the mundanes.
Term you like, didn't really know what to think. So you had kind of a juxtaposition there of two mutually exclusive groups, which sort of looked at each other and shook their heads and maybe shuddered a little bit and went their separate ways.
Well, it didn't help that the bigger the hotel, the El Cortez never did that to us, but the bigger the hotel, especially in conventions we would attend up in Los Angeles. I helped also on the committee of a Dark Shadows convention. The Marriott would schedule other things on the same convention floor, assuming that you can all get along. They would put church groups into the middle of the convention floor, the Dark Shadows.
Now this was the Marriott on Century Boulevard, right across from LAX.
And that was an interesting experience. I mean, they literally freaked these poor people out, because you've got, one of our friends sitting at the bottom of the escalator in his looks like a business suit until the church people get to the bottom of the escalator and he opens his mouth and he's got vampire fangs on, just freaking the mundanes, as we call it, which wasn't
Well,
nice.
a lot of them like to do that deliberately.
That was deliberate. So the hotels were often clueless about scheduling these groups at the same time.
It was always interesting to see the reaction, to observe the reaction of one group to the other, and then some of us with cooler heads would try to arrange a meeting of the mind, saying, no, these are perfectly normal people who just like to dress up in costumes or pursue this affectation once or twice a year, and they really do at other times have jobs and kids and drive cars and pay a mortgage.
Believe it or not.
Believe it or not.
Well, I remember that Dark Shadows convention where they put the church group into the middle of. There was one lady in her 70s who walked up to me in the lobby by that escalator and asked me what was going on, and I just said, "It's okay. It's just a convention of fans of a silly vampire. It's just a silly vampire TV show." And the star of the TV show was standing behind me, and I didn't know it. Turned around and looked at it and said, "Sorry, but it is."
So it sounds like the El Cortez was just the most welcoming environment for both.
It was.
Oh, it was. The staff was pretty cool. I mean, they had a lot of groups in there from time to time that they thought were probably just as strange as ours.
Oh, they said that. They said as much. Greg Bear just said that upstairs, that the El Cortez, I think it was him, that said the El Cortez told us you were not by far the rowdiest bunch of people. Comic-Con wasn't anywhere near the rowdiest. He said, you should see the insurance salesman's convention. Those guys were a lot noisier, apparently.
Well, there's an interesting anecdote about how it works both ways that has been going around for many years. That was told by Jim Shooter, who was for many years the publisher of Marvel Comics, who was down in Little Rock, Arkansas for a comic book convention. And one time he got into an elevator wearing a business suit, because Jim Shooter always wore a nice suit wherever he went. And there was this guy in the elevator wearing flip-flops and cut-off jeans, and he had this big pig on his head.
Foam rubber
hog, because I guess it had something to do with the Arkansas Razorbacks. There was some sort of a football function going on at the hotel at the same time, and he said, "You there with them there funny book people?" And Jim Shooter said, "Well, yes, I am." "Well, that's an awfully damn funny way for a man to make a living." Or something like that.
Damn silly thing for a grown man to be doing, he says, with the hog on his head.
With wearing this hog on his head.
And Jim Shooter said, I looked up at his hog,
and I didn't say
and I
a
looked
word.
Down at his shorts, and I said, I didn't say a word. I shook my head and got off the elevator.
So that's an interesting example of how it sometimes can work both ways. But he took the diplomatic way out and bit his tongue. And
I love that story.
reply
It's so funny.
With leading to this question, what does San Diego mean to pop culture then, especially the Comic-Con to EchoCon? Why is San Diego this place where it all comes together?
Well, San Diego has always been a place where a lot of people like to live because of the climate. So a lot of people come here and visit, and then they want to live here afterwards, so they bring their interests and activities and experiences with them. I mean, you can walk over to Coronado and ask any retired admiral there, well, why did you stay at San Diego? Oh, because I was based here when I was in the service, and I decided to come back and live here afterwards. And many people from Comic-Con who come from other towns and attend the convention, they want to move here, and some of them actually have. So part of it is because of San Diego's geographic location, and because in the past it's been such a center of the aerospace industry and now the biomedical industry. It's attracted people from all over the country and all over the world who've come and worked here and then made their home here. Are you familiar with Plat 19 down there along Pacific Highway?
No.
Well, that's that series of building down there that looks like it has the serrated top. Now, those buildings were owned by General Dynamics for many, many years, but before that, they were called Convair, which stood for the Consolidated Vultee Aircraft Corporation. Now that company was moved here from Buffalo, New York by Reuben H. Fleet in 1936, and during the war they built the PBY Catalina flying boats there, and they also built B-24 Liberators. And a lot of those people came to San Diego and stayed here after the war and raised their families here. If you've ever been up in Linda Vista, a lot of the apartments there up around Ulrich Street, around Montgomery Junior High School, were built to house those very workers during the war. And so a lot of those members of the greatest generation later gave birth to us baby boomers who later became comic book fans. So a lot of it is just because of what San Diego is. But
and because it's not LA.
Mm-hmm.
And it's becoming more like LA, but it was much more accessible. You could get places easier. The traffic wasn't as bad. The smog wasn't as bad. It was a good place to come down from LA too.
And so you have San Diego becoming more and more of a melting pot, or a place of juxtaposition of many ethnic groups, cultures, religious backgrounds, just about everything, including many people who from all these different backgrounds who became comic book and science fiction fans, and they brought their other interests with them at the same time.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question, or begin to?
And it just so happened that a lot of fans found each other here, and things grew. It probably could have happened anywhere, but it was, I think, more easily going to occur here, just because we found each other. So mostly at San Diego State. And that was,
well, a lot of it too happened after the interstate highway system was finally completed.
Mm-hmm.
It was a big deal when Highway 101 up here was finally replaced by Interstate 5, which happened in 1966. And in fact, the old Highway 101 is now known as Gilman Drive, that runs up to the UCSD campus.
That's right.
That used to be the main highway to LA.
Yeah.
And the highway out east was US Highway 80, and that was replaced by I-8 back in the mid-60s too. So that helped make it easier for people to get to San Diego.
It was much more accessible than a lot of bigger places like LA or even San Francisco, which is beautiful.
And it
hard to get around.
It wasn't viewed so much as a backwater or the end of the line anymore.
Yeah. So I think the climate and the accessibility were the two biggest draws for a lot of it.
It brought a great variety of people and all of their concomitant interests and activities here all at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So actually, you brought up San Diego State.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it important for the universities such as UCSD and SDSU to continue this work with comics and science fiction, fantasy, and movies?
Oh, heavens. Because it is part of the popular culture is part of culture. You know, it's become more accepted as part of overall culture.
As part of the mainstream culture of America.
And as part of academia. There was a day when that wasn't so, as you know, when it was looked down upon because of its pulp origins. It was looked down upon as something that either you weren't permitted to read at all because it was not acceptable, or you were expected to outgrow. It was only for boys, and it was only for young boys. And
well, it's because what's happened during the last 40 years have conferred upon science fiction and fantasy this, I think, the same sort of legitimacy that's now enjoyed by a study of Shakespeare or Cervantes or whomever you care to mention it. It's considered a legitimate academic pursuit now to study these very areas.
Once upon a time, even in our time, it was unthinkable to teach a college course in Tolkien. And now Dr. Stephen Potts is teaching a regular course for years now on nothing but Tolkien. His class is about Tolkien. And that was unthinkable initially. When I was in high school, I had an English teacher all but snatch the Two Towers out of my hand, looked down her nose, and said, "That is not acceptable literature." And it wasn't to her. And things have changed, happily. It's, I think science fiction and fantasy have finally reached acceptance level some time ago now. And we did that. I mean, all of us fans, Comic-Con and all the conventions and all the fandoms did that, I think. Because as we grew up and started becoming teachers and college professors, perforce, we brought it with us. I mean, it was what you call a portmanteau. It came along with us and became acceptable because we finally moved into those positions. And the older people retired and that looked down their noses once upon a time are now gone. So I think we brought the whole kit and caboodle along and made it acceptable because of people like Dr. Potts and David Brennan, Greg Barrett, who've made it such. We made it so.
So if San Diego State wants to teach its students about the full gamut of American culture and American cultural history, well, then they're obligated to include this as part of the curriculum.
You'll still find a few old fuddy-duddies who won't accept it, but not many anymore, I doubt it. If you've got some 80-year-old professors left out there who might not like it, I don't know. Anybody that old still teaching out there in the English department?
We'll get into that off tape.
But
I'll take that as a yes.
It's no longer just trashy literature that you're better off staying away from.
Well, some of it is.
Well, maybe some of it.
Some of it.
I guess like the only last question I have is if you could describe Comic-Con in one word, what would you describe it as?
Comic-Con then or now? Or overall?
Just Comic-Con overall. If you could choose one word to associate it with, what would you pick?
Overwhelming.
I would just say fun. I mean, that's what we got involved for in the first place. When it stops being fun, then I won't do it anymore. But so far, I'm still having fun. Getting older is mandatory. Growing up is entirely optional. So.
Well, that's one thing that Sheldorf told me one time that I did like. He said it's important to not let that kid that's inside you die. Just do whatever you have to keep him alive and to keep him going. And he obviously did that in his life, and I want to keep on doing that in my life as long as I'm able. So that's why I keep going to Comic-Con. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm talking to you.